In the dusty heart of New Mexico, under a sun that showed no mercy, a young woman stood trembling on a wooden platform. Her name was Mary Allen, only 19, sold at an auction by the very man who should have protected her, her father. With every bid, her shame grew heavier, until silence fell. A single voice cut through the crowd. $50, said a tall, widowed rancher, his face marked by years of loss and hardship. The people gasped. Why would a man like him pay so much for a girl no one wanted? What secret weighed on his heart? What did he see in her that others ignored? This was the beginning of a story written in dust and sorrow, where two wounded souls would be forced together by fate. The question remained, would love take root in the barren land of their past, or would the shadows of pain consume them both? The year was 1887, in the borderlands of New Mexico Territory. The settlement of Dustwood was little more than a cluster of adobe houses, a saloon, a small church, and a market square where the harsh desert winds often carried more gossip than grain. Life here was raw, unforgiving, and dictated by land, cattle, and reputation. In this world, women had little choice. They were daughters to be married off, wives to obey, or widows to endure their silence. Mary Allen, barely 19, had known little kindness in her life. Her father, a man broken by debt and drink, saw her not as flesh and blood, but as a means of barter. When the day came, he led her to the square like livestock, announcing her age, her health, her obedience. The shame of it burned her cheeks, but Mary did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears never softened cruelty. The crowd of ranch hands, drifters, and merchants treated the auction as if it were just another trade. Some laughed, some sneered, some whispered. Only a few lowered their eyes, unwilling to meet the quiet humiliation carved on the young woman's face. It was then that Thomas Reed appeared. A man in his late 30s, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face hardened by years under the sun and by a grief no one dared mention. Once he had been known as a devoted husband and a father, but since the fever took both his wife and son, Thomas had become a shadow in his own ranch, working in silence, his land thriving but his heart empty. When he raised his voice, $50, it was not simply an offer, it was a choice. A defiance against the cruel spectacle. No one outbid him, no one dared. The townsfolk whispered, why did the widowed rancher take her? Was it pity, obligation, or something else entirely? Mary herself did not know whether to fear him or to trust him. She only knew that, with the strike of her father's hand and the sound of coins exchanged, her life had been sealed. Beyond the square, the desert stretched endlessly and merciless. Yet somewhere in the barren soil of Dustwood, seeds of change were waiting. The wagon creaked as it rolled out of Dustwood, its wheels grinding against the hard, sun-baked earth. Mary sat stiffly on the wooden seat beside Thomas Reed, her hands clenched in her lap. She dared not look at him, nor at the townsfolk who still whispered as the wagon disappeared into the horizon. The heat pressed down like a weight, and every sound, the squeak of the wheels, the cry of a hawk overhead, seemed to deepen her unease. Thomas did not speak. His profile was stern, etched with lines of hardship. He guided the mules with practiced hands, eyes fixed on the road ahead. Silence stretched between them, heavy, but not hostile. It was the silence of two lives abruptly bound together, neither knowing what tomorrow would bring. As the desert gave way to rolling hills and sparse mesquite trees, Mary stole a glance at him. His jaw was strong, his shoulders broad, but what struck her most were his eyes, dark, unreadable, carrying a sorrow too deep to name. She quickly looked away, her heart beating faster. By late afternoon, the wagon reached Hope Ranch. The land stretched wide, bordered by wooden fences and shadowed by distant mountains. The house stood firm, 2 stories of weathered wood and stone, with a porch that faced the endless horizon. To Mary, it felt less like a home than a monument to loneliness. Thomas helped her down. His hand was rough, calloused, but his touch was careful. "You'll stay here," he said quietly, nodding toward the east wing. His voice was deep, calm, carrying no threat. Yet Mary's stomach twisted. She nodded, unable to form words. Inside, the house smelled of cedar and dust. Photographs lined the mantel, an auburn-haired woman holding a small boy, both smiling, both gone. Mary's breath caught. She realized this was not just a house. It was a tomb of memories. That night, she lay awake on a narrow bed in her new room, listening to the old timbers creak. Outside, the wind howled against the shutters. She thought of her father's face, cold and unyielding, and of the man who now claimed her future with $50. She did not weep. Instead, she wrapped her arms around herself and whispered a promise no one else would hear. "I will not break. Not again." Meanwhile, in the main room, Thomas sat by the dying fire. A glass of whiskey rested untouched on the table. He stared into the flames, seeing not fire, but ghosts, the laughter of his son, the gentle voice of his wife. He had not intended to buy Mary. He told himself it was pity, perhaps duty. Yet when he saw her eyes, downcast but burning with silent defiance, something inside him shifted. The night deepened. 2 souls, strangers bound by fate, lay under the same roof, each haunted, each scarred, yet unknowingly standing at the threshold of a story that neither had chosen, but that might one day choose them. Morning came with a pale light spilling over the desert. Mary awoke in her small room, the air cool and still, as if the house itself held its breath. She dressed quickly in the same worn dress she had arrived in, her fingers trembling slightly as she tied the ribbon at her waist. The silence of the place unnerved her, broken only by the sound of boots on the wooden floor outside. She opened the door to find Thomas already awake, his broad frame silhouetted against the rising sun through the porch. He was carrying a bucket of water, moving with the steady rhythm of a man accustomed to labor. He glanced at her briefly, then looked away, as if careful not to intrude. "There's work here if you want it," he said, voice low, "but no one will force you." Mary nodded. Her throat felt too tight to reply. She followed him to the kitchen, where a pot of black coffee simmered on the stove. He poured a cup and set it before her. She cupped it in both hands, surprised by the simple kindness. Her first time since leaving Dustwood, she felt a flicker of warmth not from the sun, but from a gesture. The day unfolded with tasks. Mary swept the dusty floors, wiped the windows clouded with grime, and tended to the small garden near the porch. Thomas worked outside, repairing fences and checking the livestock. They spoke little, yet every silence between them seemed charged, neither comfortable nor hostile, but something in between, like a bridge being built one plank at a time. At noon, while hanging laundry in the wind, Mary noticed Thomas watching her from the corral. His expression was unreadable but not cruel. She lowered her gaze quickly, her cheeks flushed, though she could not explain why. That evening they sat opposite each other at the wooden table. Dinner was plain, beans, bread, and a slice of salted pork. Mary ate quietly, aware of his presence more than the food itself. At one point she dared to ask, "Why Why did you buy me? The question hung heavy in the air.
Thomas set down his fork slowly, his eyes dark under the lamplight. Because I couldn't stand to watch, he answered simply. A woman treated like cattle. No one spoke, so I did. Mary's breath caught. There was no tenderness in his tone, no attempt at flattery, only truth. She realized then that whatever this man carried inside him, it was not cruelty, and for the first time in years she allowed herself to believe, just barely, that maybe she was not entirely alone.
The day slipped into a rhythm, though an uneasy one. Mary woke before sunrise, her body driven more by habit than choice. She fetched water from the well, scrubbed the floors until her arms ached, and baked simple bread with the little flour she found in the pantry. Thomas rarely spoke, yet she could feel his presence everywhere. When he carried lumber across the yard, when he returned dusty from the fields, when his shadow passed outside her window at dusk. One afternoon, as she knelt in the garden, pulling weeds from the dry soil, Mary felt eyes upon her. She turned to see Thomas leaning on the fence, arms crossed. His gaze was not sharp, not the gaze of ownership, but something quieter, searching. She lowered her eyes quickly, her hands fumbling in the dirt. "Those plants won't grow without more water," he said, his tone steady. "The well's deeper than it looks. I'll show you tomorrow." It was the first offer of guidance he had given her, and Mary nodded without lifting her head. At night, while clearing the dishes, her hand slipped and a plate shattered on the floor. She froze, her body stiff, her breath shallow. Memories of raised fists and cruel words from her father surged back like a storm. She braced for anger. But Thomas did not shout. He crouched, gathering the shards with his bare hands. "We have more plates," he said simply. His calmness unsettled her more than rage would have. For a moment she stood trembling, unsure whether to believe in such gentleness. Later, alone in her room, Mary pressed her palms together tightly. The world she had known had taught her that mistakes were punished, that kindness was a mask, and yet something inside whispered that maybe, just maybe, this house was not the same prison she had left behind. Meanwhile, Thomas sat on the porch, staring into the vast desert night. He thought of his late wife's laughter, of his son's small hand in his own. He thought too of Mary, the fear in her eyes, the way she worked without maint, the silence that clung to her like a second skin. He told himself he had bought her to save her from humiliation. But as the stars burned cold above, he could no longer deny the truth. He wanted to believe in her, perhaps even needed her to remind him that life still had meaning. The ranch, once steeped in silence, now carried two sets of footsteps. Two ghosts walking the same halls, both uncertain, both afraid to name the fragile hope that was slowly, quietly, beginning to grow. The following morning, Thomas kept his word. At dawn, he led Mary to the old stone well behind the barn. The rope creaked as he lowered the bucket, the echo of water rising from depths she could not see. "Hold it steady," he instructed, handing her the rope. His hands brushed hers, calloused against soft skin, and she flinched before catching herself. Thomas stepped back, giving her space. Mary pulled, surprised by the weight, the rough fibers burning her palms. She staggered slightly, but the bucket emerged, heavy and full. Thomas nodded. "You're stronger than you think." The words lingered in her chest, longer than they should have. Days passed, and a fragile routine grew between them. Mary cleaned, cooked, tended the garden. Thomas mended fences, worked cattle, fixed the roof. In the evenings, they shared meals in silence. Yet beneath that quiet, something unspoken simmered, glances quickly averted, hands brushing over the same loaf of bread, moments where words hung unspoken but heavy. One afternoon, a storm gathered over the desert. Thunder rolled across the plains, and the air thickened with the scent of rain. Mary hurried to bring the laundry inside, her skirt whipping in the wind. As she struggled with a sheet, the sky split open with lightning, startling her. She stumbled backward straight into Thomas's arms. For a heartbeat, neither moved. His grip was firm but gentle, his chest solid against her back. She froze, heat rushing to her cheeks. He released her immediately, stepping away as if burned. "Careful," he muttered, his voice rougher than usual. Mary clutched the sheet to her chest, heart racing, words caught in her throat. She could only nod. That night, the storm raged. The roof rattled, the shutters banged, and Mary lay awake listening to the fury outside. Then came a crash, a tree branch breaking near the barn. She bolted upright. Through the window, she saw Thomas running into the storm, lantern in hand. Fear tightened her chest. Without thinking, she told off with He threw on her shawl and followed. The wind lashed at her face, the rain soaking through her dress. She reached the barn to find Thomas struggling to secure the doors against the gale. Without hesitation, Mary pressed her weight against the wood beside him. Their hands slipped on the wet iron latch, but together they forced it shut. Breathless, dripping, they stood side by side in the flickering lantern light. His eyes met hers, dark, intense, alive in a way she had never seen. Neither spoke. The storm roared around them, but inside that moment, a different kind of storm was rising. When the storm finally eased, the night fell heavy with silence. The barn doors held, the livestock safe, but Thomas and Mary stood drenched, the lantern between them sputtering weakly. He handed her his coat, rough wool heavy with rain. She hesitated, then accepted, clutching it tightly around her shoulders. "You shouldn't have come out here," he said gruffly, though his eyes softened. "I couldn't stay inside while you fought alone," she answered before realizing her own boldness. Her voice trembled, but not from fear. Thomas looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing words that refused to leave his mouth. Finally, he only nodded, stepping back toward the house. She followed, their footsteps sinking side by side in the mud. Inside, the fire was stoked high. Steam rose from Mary's dress as she sat by the hearth, wrapping the coat tighter around herself. Thomas poured 2 mugs of coffee, his hands steady despite the weariness in his eyes. He handed her one without a word. That seeped into her, chasing away the storm's chill. For the first time in years, she felt something she could not name. Safety, perhaps, or the fragile beginnings of trust. Across the fire, Thomas studied her in silence. The lamplight caught the scar beneath her jaw, a pale crescent that spoke of wounds deeper than the skin. He wondered what cruelties had carved it there. He did not ask. Instead, he said quietly, "No one will hurt you here." Mary froze, the mug trembling slightly in her hands. She searched his face for deceit, but found only weary honesty. A knot loosened in her chest, so subtle she barely noticed it. That night, long after she had gone to her room, Thomas remained by the fire. He traced the rim of his mug, thinking of promises he had never intended to make. His ranch had been a place of shadows, but now there was someone who moved softly through its halls, bringing light without meaning to. Mary, lying awake in her narrow bed, replayed his words again and again. No one. She was new wrapped around her more tightly than the coat, more firmly than any wall. For the first time, she allowed her eyelids to close, not from exhaustion, but from a fragile sense of peace. Outside, the storm clouds drifted away, leaving the stars sharp and clear. The desert, washed clean by rain, gleamed under the moonlight, and in Hope Ranch, two hearts scarred by loss carried within them the faint but undeniable stirrings of something new. The following week brought a strange calm to Hope Ranch. The desert, refreshed by the storm, smelled of sage and damp earth. Birds returned to the fences, and the cattle grazed quietly as if the land itself had taken a breath. For Mary, the rhythm of the days grew less foreign. She began humming softly while she worked, almost unaware that sound had returned to her life. Thomas noticed. Passing by the kitchen one morning, he heard her voice, a fragile melody, nothing more than a thread of sound. He paused at the doorway unseen. For a moment, he felt the heaviness in his chest loosen. It had been years since music had lived in these walls. That evening, when Mary placed a loaf of bread on the table, Thomas said, "You've made this house different." Her hands stilled. She looked up, startled. "Different?" He nodded, eyes steady. "Less empty." The words were simple, but they struck deeper than anything she had expected. Mary lowered her gaze quickly, but her lips trembled with something angerously close to a smile. Not all in Dustwood was quiet, however. One afternoon, Mary ventured into town with Thomas for supplies. Whispers followed them like shadows. Women at the general store muttered. Men on the porch spat tobacco and eyed her with a mix of curiosity and judgment. Mary kept her head high, but inside, shame coiled tight. At the counter, the shopkeeper hesitated before addressing her, as though speaking to Thomas's hired help rather than his companion. Thomas's jaw tightened. "She speaks for herself," he said firmly, silencing the room. Mary's cheeks flushed, not with humiliation this time, but with something fiercer, pride. On the ride home, the silence between them was different, charged, alive. At last, Mary whispered, "Thank you." "You don't owe me thanks," Thomas replied, his voice rough. "You deserve respect, always." The wheels of the wagon creaked along the dusty road, but Mary hardly heard them. Those words settled in her heart, like roots seeking soil. At night, she stood by her window, watching the desert glow silver under the moon. For the first time since she could remember, she whispered to the night, not in despair, but in hope. "Maybe I belong here. Maybe this place could be mine too." The days grew longer as summer pressed down on Dustwood. Heat shimmered over the plains, and the air smelled of dry grass and sweat. At Hope Ranch, work was endless. Fences to mend, animals to tend, roofs to patch before the next storm. Mary threw herself into each task. Her hands blistered, her skin browned by the sun. She did not complain. Every chore was a way to carve a place for herself here. One evening, after hours of scrubbing laundry by the well, she faltered, nearly fainting in the heat. Thomas, returning from the fields, caught her just as she stumbled, his arm wrapped around her waist, steadying her against his chest. "You've done enough," he said firmly. "You'll wear yourself out." Mary shook her head, struggling for breath. "I can't just sit idle. I need to be useful." His eyes softened. For the first time, he allowed himself to speak plainly. "You are useful. You don't have to prove it to me." The words left her stunned, as though he had spoken a language she'd never known. She lowered her gaze, cheeks burning, then whispered, "No one has ever said that to me." Thomas released her gently, his hand lingering a second longer than necessary. The silence between them was different now, charged with something fragile, something dangerous. Later that night, Mary stepped into the main room and found Thomas at the table, sharpening a knife by lantern light. The scrape of steel against stone filled the quiet. She hesitated at the doorway, then gathered her courage. "Why do you live alone here?" she asked softly. His hands stilled. He did not look up at once. When he finally raised his eyes, the pain in them was raw. "Because once I had a family, and I lost them. Fever took them both. Since then, the house has been nothing but walls." Mary's heart tightened. She wanted to speak, to offer comfort, but words felt clumsy against grief so old and sharp. Instead, she stepped forward, laying her hand lightly on the table between them. She did not touch him, not quite, but the gesture was enough. Thomas's jaw worked as though swallowing something too heavy. Then, with a slow breath, he nodded. For the first time, his gaze held not just sorrow, but something else, a flicker of life, fragile as the flame of the lantern between them. The following days carried a quieter rhythm. Yet something had shifted between them. Mary no longer avoided Thomas's gaze entirely. Sometimes their eyes met across the yard, and though she looked away quickly, she no longer trembled. One morning, she found him in the barn tending to a wounded horse. The animal's flank bore a fresh gash, likely from barbed wire. Thomas worked patiently, his broad hands surprisingly gentle as he cleaned the wound. Mary hesitated, then stepped forward. "Let me help," she said softly. He glanced at her, then handed her a cloth. Together they worked in silence, he holding the lantern, she pressing the wound. Their hands brushed more than once, and each time Mary felt a spark race up her arm. Thomas, too, felt it, though he masked it beneath his steady focus. When the horse finally calmed, Thomas said, "You've got courage." Mary almost laughed, though there was no humour in it. "No, I've only learned what happens if I don't endure." His eyes darkened at her. "Words. You shouldn't have had to learn that." The barn fell silent again, but this time it was not the silence of strangers. It was the silence of two people standing at the edge of something neither dared to name. That evening, Mary stood on the porch, watching the horizon blush with sunset. The desert stretched wide, vast, and endless, but for the first time she did not feel swallowed by it. She heard Thomas's footsteps behind her, steady and slow. "You'll see," he said, his voice low. "This land can be harsh, but if you tend it with patience, it gives back." Mary turned, searching his face. "And people? Did they give back?" For a moment he didn't answer. Then with a faint roughness he said, "Sometimes, if you find the right ones." Their eyes met again, and this time neither looked away. The last light of day burned between them, and though no words were spoken, something had begun to take root. The following Sunday, church bells rang faintly from Dustwood. Mary had not stepped inside a church since childhood, yet Thomas asked if she wished to attend. She hesitated, then shook her head. Not yet. So instead, they spent the morning repairing the small garden behind the house. The soil, loosened by recent rain, was easier to till. Mary's hands grew dirty, but she did not mind. She liked the feel of earth beneath her fingers, as though each seed she planted was a promise to herself. Thomas worked beside her, silent but steady. Every so often his hand brushed hers when passing tools, and neither spoke of it. At noon, as the sun beat down, Mary straightened and shaded her eyes. She noticed a figure on horseback far across the ridge, watching. Her stomach tightened. Thomas followed her gaze. The rider lingered a moment longer, then turned and disappeared into the hills. "Do you know him?" she asked. Thomas's jaw hardened. "No, but men who watch and do not greet rarely come with gaze-ood intentions." The unease stayed with Mary the rest of the day. That night, when she tried to sleep, shadows pressed against her window, and she remembered the weight of her father's betrayal, the danger that still lurked beyond Hope Ranch. Thomas sensed her fear. He left a lantern burning in the hall, its soft glow a silent assurance. For Mary, that simple act meant more than any oath. A few days later, Thomas rode into town for supplies, leaving Mary alone at the ranch. The hours stretched heavy with silence. As she fetched water, a rustle in the brush made her freeze. She turned. Nothing. Yet the unease grew. When Thomas returned at dusk, he found her pale, clutching the shawl tight around her shoulders. "I thought I saw someone," she whispered. He scanned the horizon, eyes narrowed, every muscle taut. "If there's danger, it won't find you unprotected." For the first time, he placed his hand over hers, not fleeting, not accidental. "You're safe here," he said again, firmer now.
Ma, Annie wanted to believe, and for the first time, she almost did. The next morning dawned with a sky of pale gold. Mary woke early, the memory of the mysterious rider still lingering in her thoughts. She busied herself in the kitchen, kneading bread, anything to keep her hands from trembling. Thomas entered quietly, setting his rifle against the wall. "Tracks," he said simply. "Fresh ones, near the north fence. Someone's been watching." Mary's stomach tightened. "Do you think it's him?" Thomas did not answer immediately. He poured water into a tin cup, his movements deliberate. "I don't know yet, but whoever it is, they won't touch you." His tone left no room for doubt. Later that day, Mary wandered to the garden, needing air. The sun was high, the earth warm beneath her palms as she touched the young shoots breaking through the soil. She whispered to them, as if they could hear, "Grow strong. Don't be afraid." A shadow fell across her. She looked up to see Thomas standing there, hat in hand. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. The silence stretching long. "You talk to plants?" he asked, a hint of softness in his voice. Mary smiled faintly, almost shy. "They listen better than people." Something flickered in his eyes, amusement, maybe even admiration. He stepped closer. "You're braver than you know, Mary." Her breath caught. No one had ever spoken her name like that before, steady, respectful, as though it belonged to her alone. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Mary and Thomas sat on the porch, the desert bathed in firelight. They did not touch, did not speak much. Yet in the quiet, there was a sense of belonging, fragile but real. For Mary, who had known only fear and rejection, it was the first time she allowed herself to imagine a different kind of life. And for Thomas, who had lived years with ghosts, it was the first time he felt the weight of his loneliness lift, if only slightly. The following days brought both peace and tension. Mary grew more comfortable moving about the ranch, her footsteps sure where once they had been hesitant. She fed the chickens, fetched water, even dared to hum as she worked. Thomas watched quietly, a strange warmth rising each time he saw her hands busy with tasks that once left the house hollow. One afternoon, while mending a fence together, Thomas handed her a hammer. Their fingers brushed, rough against delicate, and for a moment both froze. Mary pulled back quickly, cheeks flushed, but not with fear. As the sun sank, Thomas leaned on the post, wiping sweat from his brow. "You've worked hard," he said. Mary looked at him, hesitant. "Hard work keeps me alive." He tilted his head. "No, heart does that. Work only gives it shape." She blinked,
startled by the thought. The words sank deep, as though he had named something she had long forgotten. That evening, Dustwood stirred with whispers again. A neighbour stopped by with a warning. M.
had been asking about Mary at the saloon. Tall, scar across his cheek, calling himself Ramon, Mary's blood ran cold. Her past, the one she had hoped was buried, was clawing its way back. She gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. Thomas's jaw hardened. "If he comes here, he won't take you." Her voice trembled. "But the law, the papers my father signed." "The law doesn't own you," Thomas said firmly. "No man does." For a long moment, silence wrapped around them. Mary searched his face, expecting anger or pity. Instead, she saw only steel, unyielding, but protective. It stirred something in her she had never known before. Not fear, not duty, but a fragile thread of trust. That night, Mary sat by the window, staring into the desert dark. Somewhere out there, Ramon was moving closer. But for the first time, she felt she was not alone in the fight. Hope Ranch, once nothing more than a stranger's house, had begun to feel like a shield. 2 nights later, the threat revealed itself. Mary awoke to the distant bark of dogs, then the creak of a gate swinging open. Her heart raced. She slipped from bed and peered through the window. Moonlight spilled across the yard, and there, near the barn, a figure moved. Before she could cry out, Thomas was already awake. He appeared at her door, rifle in hand, his expression sharp, all softness gone. "Stay inside," he ordered. But Mary followed, barefoot on the cold floor, refusing to hide. From the porch, she saw him stride into the yard, the lantern's glow cutting across the dark. "Show yourself," he called. The figure stepped forward, and the moon revealed a scarred cheek, a cruel smile. "Ramon." Mary gasped, clutching the doorframe. "So," Ramon drawled, his accent thick. "The little dove has found herself a cage, but cages break." Thomas raised the rifle slightly, steady and unshaken. "You'll leave now. You've no claim here." Ramon laughed, the sound low and dangerous. "Her father's old her." "Papers signed, money paid. She is mine." Mary's voice broke through the night. "I am not yours." Her cry carried across the yard, trembling yet fierce. Thomas's eyes flicked to her, then back to Ramon. "You heard her." The silence that followed was thick, stretched taut like wire. Ramon's hand shifted toward his belt, where the glint of a knife caught the moonlight. In a breath, Thomas's rifle cocked. "Don't." The word was quiet, but deadly. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Ramon's smile faded. He spat on the ground, eyes burning with promise. "This isn't over." He turned, mounting his horse, and vanished into the night. Mary's knees nearly gave way. Thomas was beside her in an instant, steadying her with one hand at her back. She could feel the heat of him, the strength in his touch. "You're safe," he murmured, though his jaw was still tight with fury. "I won't let him near you." Tears filled Mary's eyes, but this time they were not only of fear. For the first time she felt the power of someone standing with her, not above her, not against her, but beside her. After Ramon's appearance, the ranch no longer felt untouched by danger. Thomas kept his rifle closer than before, and Mary noticed the way his eyes scanned the horizon whenever he stepped outside.
The easy rhythm they had begun to build was broken by the shadow of threat. Still, Mary refused to cower. She worked harder in the garden, kept the house warm, and even practiced using the small pistol Thomas reluctantly placed in her hands. "It's not for fear," he told her, steadying her grip. "It's for knowing you can fight if you must." The weapon felt heavy, foreign, but when Mary pulled the trigger and heard the crack echo across the fields, something inside her shifted. She was no longer only the girl who had been sold. She was someone who could stand. That night, as they sat by the fire, Mary dared to ask, "Why do you care what happens to me? You could have walked away that day in Dustwood." Thomas looked at her for a long moment, the flames flickering across his face. "Because I saw myself in you," he admitted quietly. "Alone. Lost. And I couldn't bear to watch another soul be left that way." Her chest tightened, not with fear, but with something warmer, frightening in its own right. "Then we're both ghosts," she whispered. He leaned back, his gaze fixed on the fire. "Maybe, but ghosts can learn to live again." The words lingered between them, filling the silence with possibility. The following morning, while Mary hung linens to dry, a rider approached the gate. For an instant, her breath stopped, fearing Ramon had returned. But it was a stranger, an older woman in a worn bonnet, riding a mule. She introduced herself as Mrs. Calder, a widow from a nearby ranch. "I heard about you, dear," she said to Mary, her eyes kind. "Folks in town talk too much. Don't listen. You have a place here, if you make it." Mary swallowed hard, grateful for the woman's kindness. It was the first time since coming to Hope Ranch that another voice besides Thomas's had spoken to her without. Evenly in the world main aftus before 5 metal inside that mind Billiam was ta'en with judgment. As the woman rode away, Thomas touched the brim of his hat in respect. Mary watched her disappear down the trail, a flicker of hope lighting inside her chest. Perhaps not everyone saw her as a burden. Perhaps she truly could belong. The days that followed carried a new kind of strength. Mary no longer walked with her shoulders hunched. Instead, she began to lift her chin, her eyes meeting Thomas's more often. The echo of Mrs. Calder's words lingered in her heart. "You have a place here, if you make it." One evening, after finishing supper, Mary lingered by the porch while Thomas cleaned his tools. The sky above Dustwood burned crimson, fading slowly into indigo. For the first time, Mary felt the beauty of the desert, not as a prison, but as a wide open promise. "You ever think about leaving this place?" she asked quietly. Thomas set down the whetstone, considering. "I did, once, after." His voice trailed, shadowed by grief. Then he shook his head. "But the land's in my blood. Even if it hurts, it's home." Mary hugged her shawl tighter. "I never had a home. Just houses I was passed through." He looked at her then, steady and unflinching. "You have one now." The words struck her harder than any embrace. Her breath caught, and for a heartbeat she could not speak. She only nodded, though her chest ached with a fragile, unfamiliar warmth. That night she drank not of chains or dark alleys, but of lantern light on wooden walls, of a voice telling her she was safe, yet danger still prowled at the edges. 2 ranch hands who worked for Thomas returned from town with rumors. Ramon had been seen again, drinking, asking questions. Some said he boasted he'd come to reclaim what was his. Thomas's expression hardened at the news. He kept it from Mary at first, but she sensed the weight in his silence. When she confronted him, he admitted, "Yes, he's near, but I'll be ready." Mary's hands trembled, yet her voice steadied. "I don't want you to fight for me alone. Teach me more. Let me stand with you." Thomas studied her, torn between fear and respect. Finally, he gave a slow nod. "All right, but you must promise me one thing." "What?" "Don't lose yourself to his shadow. You're more than what he tried to make you." Her throat tightened. She whispered, "I'll try." And in that promise, fragile yet unbroken, the bond between them deepened, not only protector and protected, but something greater, a partnership forged in trust. Training began the very next morning. Thomas took Mary beyond the corral, where the land stretched wide and empty, the air crisp with dawn. He handed her the pistol again, adjusting her stance with patient hands. Feet apart, grip steady. Don't fight the recoil, guide it. Mary nodded, jaw set. She fired once, the shot ringing sharp against the canyon walls. The bullet struck just shy of the target, but Thomas gave a faint smile. Better. For hours they practiced. By noon, sweat dampened Mary's brow, her arms aching, yet her determination never faltered. Each shot grew surer, each breath steadier. She was not just learning to defend herself, she was reclaiming the power stolen from her. Afterward, they sat beneath the shade of a mesquite tree, sharing a canteen of water. Thomas watched her, the sun gilding her hair, and felt a pang deep in his chest. She was no longer only the frightened girl on an auction block. She was becoming something stronger, something luminous. "You surprise me, Mary," he said quietly. She met his gaze, her lips curving in the faintest smile. "I'm surprising myself." The bond between them tightened in ways neither spoke aloud. That evening, while Mary prepared supper, Thomas entered the kitchen carrying a small box. He set it on the table and opened it to reveal a silver locket, slightly tarnished. "It belonged to my wife," he said, voice low. "I thought I'd never part with it. But I want you to have it now. Not as a burden, but as proof you belong here." Mary's breath caught. Her fingers hovered over the locket before finally touching it. The metal was cool, heavy with history. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. "I don't know if I deserve this," she whispered. Thomas shook his head. "It isn't about deserving. It's about starting again." She clutched the locket to her chest, a fragile anchor in a life once adrift. In that moment, for the first time, she allowed herself to believe she might not only survive, but truly live. The locket never left Mary's neck after that night. She wore it tucked close to her heart, as though the silver carried more than memory. It carried a promise. Every time her fingers brushed against it, she felt steadier, stronger. Thomas noticed the change. She moved with more certainty. Her laughter, small, hesitant, began to surface in the quiet hours of the ranch. One afternoon, while hanging laundry, she laughed softly at the wind tugging at a sheet. The sound startled Thomas so deeply that he stopped in his tracks. He hadn't heard laughter within these walls since his wife's passing. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Thomas joined Mary on the porch. The desert glowed in hues of fire and gold. For a while, they said nothing. Then Thomas spoke, voice thick. "When I gave you that locket, I wasn't letting go of my past. I was choosing a future." Mary's throat tightened. "And you think I could be part of it?" His gaze met hers, unwavering. "You already are." Her heart pounded. Yet he didn't look away. The silence that followed was full, not empty, weighted with the truths they were both too afraid to speak aloud. But peace was fragile. The very next day, a rider came hard up the trail, one of the hired hands, breathless with urgency. "Ramon's in town, drunk, loud. He says he's coming for her." Mary's face drained of colour, but she stood tall. "Then let him come. I won't run." Thomas gripped her shoulders firmly. "You won't face him alone, not ever." They began to prepare. Thomas cleaned his rifle, checked the locks, reinforced the barn doors. Mary gathered supplies, lit lamps, steadied her hands on the pistol she had trained with. Fear throbbed beneath her ribs, but alongside it was something new: resolve. That night, as the ranch lay under a restless sky, Mary sat by the fire, the locket warm against her skin. She whispered a vow to herself. No more chains, no more cages. If Ramon comes, he will not find the same girl he once sought to claim. Outside, the desert wind carried whispers of dust and danger. But within Hope Ranch, two souls scarred by loss braced themselves not as strangers bound by fate, but as allies bound by choice. The night before, Ramon was expected. The ranch felt tense, every shadow sharp, every sound amplified. Mary moved through the rooms, lighting lanterns, her hands steady, though her heart pounded. Thomas sat at the table, rifle across his knees, his expression unreadable. "Will he really come?" she asked at last. Thomas's gaze flicked to her, calm but firm. "Yes, men like him don't make threats they won't try to keep." Mary drew a deep breath, touching the locket at her chest. "Then I'll be ready." He studied her, something flickering in his eyes. Worry, pride, perhaps both. "Stay close to me. Whatever happens, you do not stand alone." The hours dragged. Outside, coyotes cried in the distance, and the wind rattled the shutters. Mary sat by the fire, pistol in her lap, her fingers tracing its grip as though willing courage into her veins. Memories of her father, of being sold, of Ramon's cruel smile, all surged within her. But each time fear rose, she reminded herself of Thomas's words. "No one he owns you." At midnight, hoofbeats broke the silence. Slow, deliberate, approaching the gate. Mary froze, her breath shallow. Thomas rose, rifle steady, and motioned for her to stay back. But she did not retreat. She stood at his side. The gate creaked open. Ramon rode into the yard, a dark figure beneath the pale moon. Two men followed behind him, rough and armed. His smile gleamed like a blade. "I told you I would come," he sneered, swinging down from his horse. His eyes raked over Mary. "And I will take what is mine." Mary's hand tightened on the pistol. "I am not yours," she said, voice steady, surprising even herself. Thomas stepped forward, rifle aimed square. "You will leave now, alive if you're wise." Ramon's men shifted, their hands brushing weapons. Tension coiled thick in the air, the yard poised on the edge of violence. Mary's pulse thundered, but she stood her ground. For the first time, she was not just the girl running from chains. She was someone ready to fight for her life, her place, and the fragile hope she had begun to build. The desert night held its breath. The standoff stretched long, the desert air heavy with tension. Ramon's men shifted uneasily, their boots crunching against the gravel. The firelight from the house flickered across their faces, revealing more greed than courage. Thomas stood firm, rifle leveled, his body still as stone. "Turn around," he said, his voice low, steady as iron. "This is your last chance." Ramon smirked, his scar twisting in the moonlight. "You think one man can stop 3? You're a fool, Reed." Thomas didn't move. "Try me." Mary's pulse hammered, but she refused to hide. Her pistol was heavy in her hands, yet her grip was steady. She stepped forward, placing herself just behind Thomas's shoulder. Her voice rang clear. "If you touch this land, if you touch me, you'll regret it." Ramon barked a laugh, but it faltered when his gaze met hers. There was no fear in her eyes now, only resolve. The silence cracked when one of Ramon's men drew his pistol. In an instant, Thomas fired. The shot thundered across and the man fell, his weapon clattering in the dirt. The other froze, torn between fight and flight. "Enough!" Thomas roared, his voice echoing like the storm itself. Ramon snarled, fury twisting his features. He pulled his knife, lunging forward. But before he could strike, Mary lifted her pistol. Her finger tightened, and the shot rang out. The bullet grazed Ramon's arm, sending his knife spinning to the ground. He staggered back, eyes wide with shock and rage. Blood darkened his sleeve. For the first time, the predator looked uncertain. Mary's hands shook, but she did not lower the gun. "Leave," she said, breath trembling but firm, "and never come back." Ramon glared at her, chest heaving. Then, with a curse, he backed toward his horse. "This isn't finished," he spat, clutching his wound. Mounting quickly, he galloped into the night, his last man following. The yard fell silent, except for the echo of hoofbeats fading into the desert. Mary's knees buckled, but Thomas caught her, pulling her close. For a long moment, neither spoke. Her tears fell freely, but they were tears of release, not defeat. "You did it," Thomas whispered, his voice rough. "You stood your ground." Mary clutched the locket, her breath shuddering. "I'm not afraid anymore." And in that silence, with the desert wind washing over them, both knew the battle was more than survival. It was the beginning of something unbreakable. The morning after the confrontation, the ranch was quiet, but the silence was different now. It was not fear that hung in the air. It was relief, heavy but liberating. The yard still bore the marks of the fight, scuffed dirt, a broken lantern, the faint smell of gunpowder. Yet for Mary, the land had never looked more like home. She moved through her chores with a lightness she had not felt before. Her hands still trembled when she thought of Ramon's eyes, full of rage, but the trembling passed quickly. For the first time, she realized she had faced her greatest fear and survived. Thomas watched her closely, noting the steadiness in her step, the quiet strength in her posture. He had seen many women in his life, neighbors, townsfolk, his late wife, but never had he seen someone transform so completely before his eyes. At midday, they sat together beneath the cottonwood tree. The shade was cool, the breeze gentle. Mary traced the locket at her neck, then looked at Thomas. "Do you think
I'll return?"
Thomas's gaze drifted to the horizon.
"Yes, men like him don't give up easy.
His hand tightened on his knee.
But next time, we'll be ready."
Mary nodded, surprising herself with the calm in her voice. "Then I'll be ready too." He turned to her, eyes steady.
You already proved that last night. You don't need to prove it again.
A silence fell, softer than before. This time it carried no fear, only an unspoken closeness neither could deny. But as dusk fell, new rumors reached Hope Ranch. A rider from town brought word. Ramon had gathered more men, drinking and swearing revenge. He was wounded, humiliated, and men like him did not forgive easily. Thomas listened, jaw tight. After the rider left, he paced the porch, his mind already preparing for the storm to come. Mary watched from the doorway, her heart heavy but resolute. She knew what this meant. The battle was not finished. That night, as the wind swept across the plains, Mary lay awake, the pistol by her side. She was no longer the girl trembling at every shadow, but neither was she naive. She understood that Ramon would not rest until he tried again. Outside, Thomas stood guard, rifle in hand, his figure outlined against the moon. He had fought alone for years, but now, for the first time, he knew he did not stand alone. The desert seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Something darker was coming. The days that followed were marked by waiting. Hope Ranch became a fortress. Lanterns trimmed, weapons polished, every door secured. Thomas worked from dawn until dusk, reinforcing fences, posting lookouts with the few ranch hands he trusted. Mary helped where she could, her hands blistered but steady, her fear tempered into resolve. At night she and Thomas spoke little, yet their silences carried weight. Sometimes he caught her staring into the fire, her fingers tight around the locket. Sometimes she found him on the porch, his face carved in shadow, eyes fixed on the horizon as though willing Ramon to appear so the waiting could end. One evening, as they prepared supper, Mary broke the quiet. "What if he comes with more men than we can fight?" Thomas set down his knife, meeting her gaze. "Then we fight anyway. But listen to me. If it comes to it, you run. Don't look back." Mary shook her head fiercely. "No, I've run enough in my life. If he comes, I'll face him beside you." His jaw tightened, torn between anger and admiration. He wanted to protect her, to shield her from the violence clawing at their gates. But he also knew she was no longer the girl who had arrived broken and trembling. She had become his equal in courage, if not in strength. That night, the wind carried strange echoes, distant laughter, the clink of bottles, the restless shuffle of hooves. Thomas and Mary stood together at the porch, watching the desert night pulse with unseen threats. "We won't have to wait much longer," Thomas murmured. Mary's heart pounded, but she lifted her chin. "Then let it come. I'm ready." In the silence that followed, their eyes met. For the first time, neither looked away. Whatever storm approached, they would face it, not as strangers tied by circumstance, but as two souls who had chosen to stand side by side. And as the first glimmer of dawn crept across the plains, the horizon stirred with the promise of battle. Dawn broke red and restless. From the porch, Thomas spotted dust rising on the far ridge, a column of riders moving fast. Ramon had returned, and this time he had not come alone. At least half a dozen men rode with him, their rifles glinting in the sun. Thomas tightened his grip on the rifle. "It's today." Mary stood beside him, the locket warm against her skin. Fear rippled through her, but it did not paralyze her. She drew a breath and nodded. "Then let it end here." The riders thundered closer, the ground trembling beneath their hooves. They pulled up at the gate, dust swirling around them. Ramon dismounted first, his arm still bandaged from her bullet. His sneer was sharper now, his voice dripping venom. "You should have known better, Reed. Harboring what belongs to me is a death sentence." Thomas stepped forward, steady as stone. "She belongs to no one, least of all you." The men behind Ramon chuckled darkly, but none moved. The tension coiled, a snake ready to strike. Mary emerged from the porch, pistol in hand. Her voice cut the silence. "You'll never touch me again, Ramon. You can bring an army, but you'll never own me." Ramon's eyes narrowed, fury flashing. "Then you die with him." He gestured, and 2 of his men raised their rifles. Gunfire split the air. Thomas fired back, dropping 1 man instantly. Mary ducked behind the porch rail, heart hammering, then rose and fired. The shot missed, but it forced the second rider to scatter, his bullet tearing into the wood beside her. Chaos erupted in the yard. Horses screamed, dust clouded the air, gunshots cracked like thunder. Thomas moved with practiced precision, every shot measured, every step deliberate. Mary fought to steady her breathing, to remember his lessons. Don't fight the recoil, guide it. She raised the pistol again and squeezed. This time her bullet struck true, grazing a rider's leg and toppling him from the saddle. Ramon charged forward through the smoke, revolver drawn, his face twisted in rage. "You'll pay for this!" he roared. Thomas met him head-on, rifle raised. For a heartbeat, time held still. The ranch, the desert, the sky itself waiting for the storm to break. The first clash was brutal. Ramon fired, the bullet grazing Thomas's arm. Thomas staggered but did not fall. His rifle barked in reply, forcing Ramon back behind a horse. Mary's heart seized at the sight of Thomas bleeding, but instinct drove her forward. She fired again, her shot striking the dirt inches from Ramon's boots. He snarled, eyes burning with hatred. Around them, the remaining men hesitated. 2 already lay wounded, another fled into the desert. The odds were shifting, and Ramon knew it. "You think this ends here?" he shouted over the chaos. "She was sold to me. She is mine by law." Mary's voice cracked through the smoke. "I am not property, not his, not anyone's." Her hands trembled, but her aim was true. She had never spoken with such fury, never claimed her life so boldly. Thomas, gritting his teeth against pain, met her gaze. For an instant, pride flickered in his eyes. "She stands free," he growled, raising his rifle. "And if you want her, you'll have to go through me." Ramon roared, charging from behind cover. He tackled Thomas to the ground, the rifle knocked aside. They grappled in the dirt, fists and fury colliding. Dust swirled around them, each man straining for control. Mary froze, pistol trembling in her grip. One shot could end it, but with the 2 men locked so tightly, she risked hitting Thomas. Her breath came ragged, panic clawing at her chest. Then she heard Thomas's voice, rough but steady, even as he fought. "Mary, trust yourself." Her vision narrowed. She steadied her arm, drew in a breath, and fired. The bullet struck Ramon's shoulder, ripping him back. He screamed, collapsing sideways into the dust. Thomas rolled free, chest heaving, his face smeared with blood and grit. He retrieved his rifle, but the fight was already decided. Ramon clutched his wound, eyes wild, teeth bared like a cornered wolf. "You'll regret this," he spat, staggering to his feet. "Both of you." But when he reached for his revolver, Thomas cocked his rifle and aimed squarely at his chest. "No more," he said flatly. The standoff hung heavy. Mary stepped beside Thomas, pistol raised, her body trembling but unyielding. 2 against 1, their silhouettes hard against the lantern light. Ramon's breath came ragged, blood seeping through his shirt. He looked from Thomas to Mary, and for the first time, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. The yard was still, save for the rasp of Ramon's breathing. Dust swirled around his boots as he staggered, blood dripping from his shoulder. His eyes flicked from the barrel of Thomas's rifle to the pistol in Mary's hands. For the first time, he looked cornered. "This land won't save you," he spat, his voice raw. "When I heal, when I gather more men, I'll come back, and nothing will stop me." Thomas's jaw clenched, finger taut on the trigger. "You're finished now. Leave while you can still walk." Mary's voice rose, steady and cutting through the night. "You've taken enough from me. You won't take another day." Ramon laughed, bitter and broken. Then with a sudden motion he lunged, not for Thomas, but for Mary. Time slowed. Thomas shifted, raising his rifle, but Ramon was too close. Mary felt the world narrow to the glint of his knife, the madness in his eyes. She raised her pistol, her breath sharp and fierce. The shot cracked like thunder. Ramon jerked back, his knife clattering to this. A dirt. For a heartbeat, silence held the ranch. Then his body crumpled, falling hard into the dust he had once tried to claim. The echoes faded into the desert night. Mary stood frozen, the pistol still raised, smoke curling from the barrel. Her hands shook violently, yet her eyes did not waver. She had ended it. Thomas stepped forward, gently lowering her arm. "It's over," he murmured. His voice was rough, but not with anger, with something closer to awe. Mary's breath came in ragged gasps. Tears blurred her vision, but they were tears of release, not despair. I stopped him," she whispered. Thomas nodded, steady and unyielding. "You saved yourself." For a long moment they stood in the quiet yard, the stars wheeling above, the earth holding its breath. Ramon lay still, the night reclaiming him. At last, Thomas reached out, his hand brushing hers. It was not the grip of possession, nor of command, but of recognition. Two survivors, bound not by fear, but by choice. Mary let the pistol toll fall to her side. The weight of chains she had carried for so long seemed to lift, replaced by the fragile but undeniable weight of freedom. The night settled heavy after Ramon's fall. The ranch was silent except for the soft whinny of horses and the hiss of the wind through the cottonwoods. Mary and Thomas stood together in the yard, the smoke of battle still clinging to the air. At last Thomas lowered his rifle. He looked at Mary, not as a fragile girl he had once rescued, but as the woman who had stood her ground and faced the storm. "You're safe now," he said, though the words felt too small for the truth of what she had done. Mary's chest rose and fell, the locket warm against her skin. She swallowed hard. "I never thought I could fight. But tonight, I wasn't just fighting him. I was fighting the part of me that still believed I was powerless." Thomas's gaze softened, "And you proved that part wrong." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the desert sky vast above them, stars blazing like witnesses. Then Thomas stepped closer. "Mary, you don't have to walk this road alone anymore, not if you choose to stay." Her breath caught, tears welling again, but this time they were gentle, not jagged. "I want to stay," she whispered, "not because I owe you, but because this is the first place that's ever felt like mine." The words hung between them, fragile and luminous. Thomas reached for her hand, and when she did not pull away, their fingers laced together, rough calluses against soft skin. The body of Ramon lay in the dust, the desert reclaiming him. By dawn, Thomas's men would bury him far from Hope Ranch. His shadow, so long looming over Mary's life, was gone. What remained was not fear, but a new beginning. 2 lives scarred and broken, yet stitched together by choice, courage, and the fierce will to survive. As the first light of morning crept over the horizon, Mary stood beside Thomas, the pistol at her side, the locket at her heart. She felt the weight of freedom settle into her bones, solid and real. And for the first time, she did not see herself as someone sold or saved or scarred. She saw herself as whole. The battle at Hope Ranch ended with Ramon lying in the dust, but the story did not end there. In many ways, what followed was even more important. The question of what it all meant. Was Mary's victory only the end of one man? Or did it mark the rebirth of a woman who had once been sold as property? One way to see the story is as a tale of freedom hard won. Mary's life had been shaped by chains. Her father's betrayal, Ramon's claim of ownership, the weight of a world that told women they were possessions rather than people. When she pulled the trigger that final time, it was not merely to stop Ramon. It was to destroy the idea that had haunted her since childhood, that her life belonged to someone else. Thomas's role can also be read as more than protector. He did not simply rescue her. He stood beside her. He offered tools, guidance, and belief. But it was Mary who fired the decisive shot. This balance between protection and empowerment is what makes their bond different from the cages she had known before. In the broader context of the American West, their struggle mirrors the harsh reality of survival. The frontier was not just a land of opportunity. It was a place where power was taken by force, where law was fragile, and where women, especially, were vulnerable. Stories like Mary's expose how easily exploitation could be justified by contracts or ownership, and how breaking free required not only strength, but defiance. There is another way to interpret the tale, as a metaphor for grief and healing. Thomas, a man hollowed by loss, chose to step into danger not because he needed another fight, but because he recognized in Mary the same emptiness that had consumed him. By standing with her, he began to heal his own wounds. And in choosing to fight beside him, Mary found not just safety, but dignity. Thus, the confrontation with Ramon becomes more than a battle. It is a symbol, the moment when the past collides with the present, when fear collides with defiance. The survival turns into rebirth. Another layer of the story lies in the way power shifts. At the beginning, Mary is powerless, her life decided by her father, her body claimed by Ramon. But through the events at Hope Ranch, that balance of power changes. She learns to hold a weapon, to raise her voice, to claim her place. By the end, the one who once seemed fragile becomes the one who fires the final shot. This reversal challenges the traditional narrative of Western tales, where women often wait to be rescued. Instead, Mary becomes the agent of her own survival. Thomas does not silence her or take her fight away. He amplifies it. He trusts her with responsibility, and in turn, she proves capable of bearing it. Theirs is not a story of rescue, but of partnership. On a psychological level, Mary's journey represents the process of reclaiming identity after trauma. Victims of betrayal or abuse often carry the belief that they are powerless, that their fate belongs to others. The act of resistance, whether by word, by acti, Mary, or by simply saying no more, is transformative. For Mary, pulling the trigger was not just about ending Ramon's threat. It was about silencing the voice inside that whispered she had no worth. Thomas's arc, meanwhile, is a study in grief reshaped by purpose. For years, he lived as a man hollowed by loss, his ranch alive, but his spirit buried. By standing with Mary, he rediscovers a reason to fight, not for revenge, but for life itself. In her, he sees not only the pain of the past, but the possibility of a future. His healing is inseparable from her liberation. Viewed collectively, the story also critiques the fragile justice of the frontier. Ramon invoked law and ownership as justification for violence. This echoes the real history of the West, where contracts, debts, or marriages often stripped women of agency. By defying that claim, Mary asserts a new law, one of dignity, autonomy, and equality. Thus, the narrative can be read not only as a romance, but as a declaration, surveillancy.
Survival is not enough. True victory lies in reclaiming the right to choose, and in building bonds rooted not in control, but in respect. At its heart, the story is also about love, but not the fragile romance of chance meetings or fleeting passion. It is a love forged in fire, born from shared scars. Both Mary and Thomas carried wounds, hers from betrayal and objectification, his from grief and loss. Alone each was broken. Together they found a mirror for their pain, and through that reflection the possibility of healing. This love does not arrive with ease. There are no sweeping declarations, no instant embraces. Instead, their bond grows slowly, tested through hardship. The quiet moments by the fire, the shared labor in the fields, the long silences heavy with unspoken truths. Each trial strips away fear until trust takes root. Mary's journey toward love is inseparable from her journey toward selfhood. For someone told her entire life that she was less than human, to choose love freely is revolutionary. Love in this sense is not surrender, it is empowerment. It is the act of saying, I am worthy, and I choose who I give my heart to. Thomas's side of the love story is just as transformative. He had closed himself off, convinced that loss had stolen his future. Mary's presence forced him to face his grief, not by forgetting, but by learning that love could exist alongside memory. For him, to love again was not betrayal of the past, but honor to it. A way of proving that even after death and loss, the human spirit can still find light. Together, they redefine what it means to belong. For Mary, belonging is no longer being owned, but being seen. For Thomas, belonging is no longer clinging to ghosts, but allowing someone new into his life. Their union is a radical reimagining of survival, not merely enduring the world's cruelty, but creating a life worth living within it. Thus, the romance at Hope Ranch is not escapism, it is testament. It tells us that love, when built on respect and courage, can turn even the harshest desert into fertile ground. What remains after the dust of Hope Ranch settles is more than a story of two people. It becomes a legacy, a reminder of what survival, dignity, and love can mean when tested against the harshest trials. For many, Mary's defiance stands as the heart of the tale. She began as someone sold, silenced, diminished. Yet by the end, she stood armed, her voice clear, her freedom seized with her own hands. This arc is not only personal, it echoes for anyone who has ever been told they were less, that they did not matter. The lesson is simple, but powerful. Survival is not the end of the journey. True freedom is found in reclaiming the right to choose. Thomas, too, leaves behind a legacy, not of conquest, but of resilience. His strength was not in how many men he could shoot, or how firmly he stood with a rifle, but in how he allowed himself to hope again. The courage to open his heart after grief, to risk connection after loss, is as radical as Mary's defiance. His story tells us that healing is not forgetting, it is daring to live fully again. Together, their union challenges a world built on power and ownership. Hope Ranch, once a lonely place haunted by ghosts, becomes a symbol, a home remade not by walls or land, but by respect and shared struggle. It says that belonging is not granted by law or bloodline, but chosen through trust. The broader message resonates beyond the desert of New Mexico. In every society, there are voices silenced, lives diminished, people treated as less.
The story of Mary and Thomas insists that such chains can be broken, not easily, not without cost, but with courage and solidarity. In this way, their tale becomes a beacon. It does not promise a world without cruelty, but it offers proof that even within cruelty, people can carve out dignity, love, and a life worth calling their own. And that, perhaps, is the greatest inheritance the story leaves. The belief that no matter how deep the scars, renewal is possible.
Finally, the story of Mary and Thomas also asks us to consider what true strength looks like. Ramon's version of strength was domination, using fear, contracts, and violence to control others. He believed power came from ownership. But his downfall reveals the truth. Control built on cruelty cannot last. Mary and Thomas embody a different strength, one grounded in resilience and trust. Mary's strength was not in physical might, but in refusing to yield to fear. Thomas's strength was not only in his rifle, but in choosing compassion over bitterness, solidarity over solitude. Together, they show that true power is not in what you own, but in how you stand, with yourself and with others. There is also a spiritual dimension. The desert is harsh, unforgiving, a place where life must fight to exist. Yet in that barren land, Mary planted seeds and watched them grow. This is not just farming, it is metaphor. Even in the hardest soil, with care and patience, something new can take root. Her garden is the mirror of her life. Once dry and desolate, now beginning to flourish. In many ways, the story is a hymn to second chances. Mary was given no choice in her beginning, but she claimed her ending. Thomas thought his life had ended with loss, but he discovered another chapter. Both remind us that destiny is not fixed. It bends when courage steps forward. For audiences, this narrative resonates because it blends romance with survival, intimacy with justice. It tells us that love is not a luxury. It can be an act of defiance, a rebuilding of dignity. It reminds us that even in times and places where laws are weak and cruelty loud, the quiet voice of resistance can still prevail. Thus, the hypothesis we draw is this. Stories like Mary and Thomas's survive, not because they are tales of the past, but because they speak to every age. Whenever someone stands against oppression, whenever love grows out of ashes, whenever dignity rises after despair, their story is told again. When the sun rose fully over Hope Ranch, the dust of battle had settled, but its echoes lingered. Ramon's body was buried far beyond the fences, a grim marker of the violence that had tried to reclaim Mary's life. For Thomas and Mary, survival brought not only relief, but a new burden. What would follow now that the immediate danger was gone? In Dustwood, rumours spread quickly. Some townsfolk whispered that Mary had killed a man. Others said Thomas had broken the law by harbouring her. Yet there were also voices that spoke differently. Voices that called it justice, that saw Ramon not as a victim, but as a predator finally stopped. In the fragile frontier, morality was often decided not by courts, but by communities, and here the community was divided. For Mary, the consequences were profound. She no longer walked with fear, but she carried the memory of the shot that ended Ramon. Freedom, she learned, does not come without weight. Each time she touched the locket, she reminded herself that she remembers that survival had a cost, and that dignity required courage. Thomas, too, bore the aftermath. His wound healed slowly, but deeper still was the recognition that by standing against Ramon, he had crossed a line he could never return from.
He was no longer the silent widower hidden on his land. He was a man who had chosen to fight, to defend, and in doing so, he had bound his fate to Mary's. Together they rebuilt Hope Ranch. What had once been only Thomas's refuge of grief became a shared space of renewal. The broken fence posts were mended, the gardens flourished, and laughter, tentative, quiet, returned to the house. The ranch itself became a testament, not only to survival, but to the possibility of a new kind of home, built on respect rather than fear. Thus, the immediate consequence of the battle was more than Ramon's defeat. It was the transformation of two people, and of a place haunted by ghosts, into something alive again. In the weeks that followed, the memory of the battle at Hope Ranch spread far beyond its fences. Dustwood, a town accustomed to whispers, now carried a story on every lip. Some spoke of Thomas Reed, the widower who stood like stone against Ramon and his gang. Others spoke of Mary Allen, the young woman who refused to be owned, who raised a pistol and claimed her freedom. For many women in the town, Mary became a quiet symbol. They too lived in a world of fragile rights, where their voices were often dismissed, where contracts and marriages sometimes felt like chains. Hearing that one of their own had faced her oppressor and survived sparked a ripple of courage. Some came to Hope Ranch not only with food or supplies, but with gratitude. They told Mary her defiance gave them strength. For Thomas, the change was subtler, but just as profound. Men who once saw him as a recluse now treated him with respect, even deference. Yet Thomas did not revel in reputation. He knew that what mattered was not what others said, but what he and Mary built each day. Fences mended, seeds planted, laughter shared. His legacy was not in the shot he fired, but in the home he remade. The land itself seemed to reflect the change. The garden flourished, the cattle grew strong, and Hope Ranch, once a place of silence, echoed with new life. Where grief and violence had left their scars, growth now took root. The desert, harsh and unforgiving, had yielded fragile but undeniable bloom. Over time, the story of Ramon's defeat became less about blood and more about transformation. It was told as a warning against those who believed people could be bought, but also as a testament that even in lawless places, dignity could prevail. Thus, the legacy of Hope Ranch extended beyond its borders. It was not only the tale of a man and a woman, but of a community reminded that freedom is possible, even where fear reigns. As the seasons turned, Hope Ranch became more than a refuge. It became a story people carried with them. Travelers passing through Dustwood repeated it in saloons and around campfires, the tale of a widower and a young woman who defied a man's claim of ownership, who stood together against violence and built something new. The story grew with each telling. Some painted Thomas as the unyielding gunslinger, others cast Mary as the fearless heroine. But those who visited the ranch saw the truth. They were not legends carved from stone, but two people who had chosen courage day after day, even in ordinary moments. Their legacy was not in gunfire, but in the quiet persistence of living with dignity. For Mary, the consequence of her defiance rippled inward as much as outward. Each morning she woke and chose to live without fear. She strengthened the new identity she had claimed. She was no longer the girl her father sold, nor the victim Ramon sought to own. She was Mary Allen of Hope Ranch, a woman who carried scars, but was defined by more than them. Thomas too found a renewed purpose. His grief did not vanish, but it transformed. The memories of his wife and son no longer held him captive. They became part of the foundation upon which he built again. In Mary's laughter, in the steady rhythm of shared labor, he found that honoring the past could coexist with embracing the future. Over time, their partnership itself became the message. Not a perfect romance, not a fairy tale, but a life where two broken souls stood as equals, bound not by desperation, but by choice. For those who heard their tale, this was perhaps the greatest legacy, proof that dignity and love can rise not from ease, but from hardship. Thus, the aftermath of Ramon's fall was more than a victory over one man. It was a reclamation of humanity, a reminder whispered across the desert plains that no chain, however heavy, can hold forever when courage and solidarity strike against it. With time, the tale of Hope Ranch faded from gossip into something more enduring, a parable whispered across the desert. Travelers told it not simply as a fight between a man and his enemy, but as proof that even in a lawless land, justice could still be claimed. For the community, the legacy was twofold. First, it reminded Dustwood that silence could be complicity. Too many had watched Ramon's cruelty for too long without speaking. When Mary stood up to him, she revealed not only his weakness, but their own. Some in town, humbled by this, began to reconsider how they treated the vulnerable among them. Others dismissed it, preferring the comfort of old hierarchies. But the seed of change had been planted. Second, the story left a reminder about what defines a home. Hope Ranch was once haunted by loss and fear. Through Mary and Thomas, it became something else, not a fortress of isolation, but a place rebuilt through trust and shared labor. This shift spoke louder than any sermon, the id. At a home is not just walls and fences, but the dignity of those who live within it. For Mary, the long-term consequence was ownership of her own narrative. No longer defined as the girl sold by her father or the woman Ramon tried to claim, she became known as the woman who chose her fate, who fought for her freedom. That legacy followed her name, reshaping it from a mark of shame into one of strength. For Thomas, the consequence was gentler, but equally profound. He had lived years under the shadow of grief, but through Mary, he was remembered not for loss, but for resilience. People no longer spoke of him only as the widower. They spoke of him as the man who built again, who stood firm, not just for himself, but for someone else. Thus, the disaster of violence birthed something paradoxical, a legacy of hope. Hope Ranch became more than a name, it became a symbol. For those who passed its gates, it stood as proof that out of betrayal, love could grow. Out of fear, courage could rise. And out of ashes, a new life could be built. The story of Mary Allen and Thomas Reed is not only about two people who survived the cruelty of the frontier. It is about the rebirth of dignity in a world that tried to strip it away. From the dusty square of Dustwood to the final battle at Hope Ranch, Mary's journey reminds us that freedom is never given. It is seized, often at great cost. Thomas, the man who had buried his heart with his family, found that hope could return in unexpected form. Mary, the woman once treated as property, discovered she could define herself, not by chains, but by choice. Together they transformed a ranch scarred by loss into a home rebuilt with respect and courage. And what remains for us, the listeners, a lesson that echoes beyond time. Strength is not domination, but endurance. Not ownership, but respect. Love, when built on equality, can heal even the deepest wounds. Hope Ranch stands as a symbol, not just of survival, but of the human power to reclaim life, to plant seeds in the hardest soil and see the momed hem bloom. If this story speaks to you, remember, it is more than fiction. It is a mirror of the battles we fight, the chains we break, and the homes we build from the ruins of pain. stay with us, subscribe, and share this story, because somewhere, someone may need to hear that no matter how deep the scars, freedom and love can still be found.